Chris Frank Calvo.
Fine. I think I begin by answering yes to the question from Joanne, but not in the sense of often that we've discussed this as if it was a return to some grand bargain between capital and labor. I think of it when I've been teaching this more in theoretical terms, the kind of thinking that was behind Anthony Giddens' book on the politics of climate change, which looked for this kind of grand bargain, or has been in the thesis of David Held around the way to restructure some of the international institutions. But I think of it much more in the sense of what has been emerging over the last 30 years within Marxist theory on thinking about the relationship between nature and the economy, in particular the way that this is linked to the processes of capital accumulation. I think in the work of Henri Lefebvre, Alvad, Bellamy Foster, O'Connor, Leibowitz, and so on, some of the projects that we've done in the Socialist Register around these issues, which I think have added a lot of new concepts in thinking about the relationship between the nature and the economy and the capitalism around the forms of energy regimes, which obviously that's what Bob just tried to attack and address, the forms of the energy regimes internal to capitalism. Entropy, the production of space, the problems of the metabolic rift internal to capitalism, and so on. And I think importantly also this question of the definition of needs and human needs and their relationship to ecology. I think of it also, I would answer it positively, also in the sense that as have been emerging in practical terms out of the union movement and the climate justice movement, which I think you can summarize it in the general terms of the struggle for a just transition to a low carbon economy, which is pro-worker, seeking environmental justice in the sense of being anti-racist and globally egalitarian. I think this has been kind of also a way that the politics around a Green New Deal have been emerging. The financial crisis allowed us to think even more widely about the potential for thinking about a just transition and the nature of the way that state intervention might be able to address climate justice issues as well. But I think in general we'd have to answer pretty negatively across the core capitalist countries about what actually occurred under the stimulus packages and the way that they were implemented around climate justice issues. Every government had an incredible amount of rhetoric about it, but in Canada it was quite clearly bullshit. You know, it was retrofitting hockey arenas on an ad hoc basis and things like this, but and a lot of kind of retrofitting of large houses. But in the terms of thinking systematically in terms of the kinds of questions that Bob addressed, almost nothing on that. And in fact, as I'm going to just speak to now, when we look concretely in terms of the actual politics, which I'll invoke the example of the Canadian state, you see in fact a negative movement through the crisis in the direction of dealing with climate change and all kinds of ecology issues. In Canada, I think we have to highlight how negatively things have been turning across the board. When you look at the general economic model of development in Canada right now, we are, alongside China, probably the greatest sinner in the world around ecology and climate change issues. The nature of what's evolved in the last period, and particularly the response to the financial crisis, has been actually to push Canada more in the direction of attempting to feed a commodities boom, partly from the demand from East Asia. This has been moving production into more riskier areas, whether it's the shale gas in the St. Lawrence, the further elements of the Arctic, the more difficult taking of oil and gas out of the Labrador, etc. And of course, as everybody knows, the tar sands projects. This is the central object and central economic development strategy and object of the Canadian government. It's coupled with a range of other areas which are also focused on this. The mining of gold and metals in the far north, the diamond strip mining and so on, means we probably now have in Canada more territory involved in really ecologically damaging production in any place in the world right now, purely in square kilometer terms. This is coupled with the movement, because of the demand in Asia, with the massive increase in coal production and export of coal. It's coupled with an incredible attack on the boreal forest, like coupled with the Amazon forest, the most important forest in the world for oxygen, etc., and the absorption of greenhouse gases. We have huge problems of the nature of the commodities pressures moving Canada even more into monocrop production in the Canadian West. We see these problems of the fisheries, water. So down the line, it's hard to see anything going very well in the right direction in Canada in these terms. It is coupled with an economic development model when we're actually looking, when we analyze it as economists, we often call it an extensive model of development. That is, it's particularly reliant on growing the market. Of Canadian growth, say it's averaging 2.5% a year as its core to maintain stable employment. About 1.5% of that comes out of demographic growth, growing the labor force, and 1% is about productivity growth. And that is the model of extensive development that has been having even increased pressure occurring. When we look at the political terrain as it's evolved, we see even more difficulties for implementing an alternative ecological agenda. Both the Social Democratic and Conservative governments in Canada are basically operating in the same direction. There isn't much difference in how they operate as governments on these issues. In all cases, across the board in Canada, our environmental budgets in 2012 are what they were in the early 1990s. They've been cut. This is before this new round of austerity that's spilling through, so our environmental budgets have been radically reduced. We keep adjusting our greenhouse gas emissions targets. We keep bumping them up. What's incredible and astonishing, the Canadian government goes around the world and it tries to undermine other governments' environmental targets, even at times, surprising for Canada, even attacking Obama's targets at times when the U.S. government becomes a little bit too more pro emissions reductions in its strategy. So I think the political terrain for pushing this alternative is terrible. The social movements, I think, also have a certain limit right now in Canada in terms of the large, and I think it's actually a common element across North America, in that the big NGOs have moved over the last decade a lot in the direction of market ecology and attempting to use market measures to deal with alternative strategies. And I think we now have enough of a period to know what are the limits of those market orientations or market ecology strategies. I think I'll just summarize this point by saying the Canadian government now typically ranks, when you look at the rankings that are done by various groups about how we're progressing on carbon emissions, etc., ranks typically at the bottom, with the bottom cluster of groups. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think in contrast to this, as I was saying, there are some interesting developments that have been occurring in the climate justice movement and in the union movement in response to this that are also picking up on some of the international trends that both Bob and Jeremy were speaking to, and I know that Elaine's work in and around Harvard has also done some work in this direction. And that is around, what would a redistributional approach to climate change issues take? The issue of green work, the question of a just transition, and so on. There's been a number of important studies, I think, that have helped generalize this. Some of them being the UNEP and the ILO study of the green jobs and towards decent work was a very important, I think, summary and strategy document of analyzing where we are on a range of kind of issues around green jobs and how to link them to a just transition. I think the European Trade Union Confederation also came out with a very good study in the midst of the crisis as developing an alternative employment strategy in terms of climate change and employment. A group of comrades in Britain came up with their 1 million climate jobs now strategy, which I think has very widely circulated within the union movement internationally. It's a quite good thing. And I think in the US, the World Watch study was quite good also on green jobs. Practically, I think what this has meant is there's been a couple of areas of initiative, I think, that have been important in posing this alternative. One has actually come in collective bargaining. There's been a couple of important studies and initiatives in Canada, surprisingly coming initiated by the NUPCHI, the National Union of Public and General Employees, and the New Brunswick Union Federation around this. One of them is called Cool Comforts, Bargaining for Our Survival, and bargaining and a subsequent update of that, which tried to start developing collective bargaining language that could be brought into agreements. Things around how to collectively bargaining, how pushing companies how to reduce carbon footprint with the numbers of clauses around that. A number of clauses dealing with forming an energy committee and what energy committees might do and bargain with the management around. And thirdly, a whole range of issues dealing with the just transition and what could be bargained with if you're able to push, or the government's pushing in the direction of a transition, what should be a range of the union clauses in around this. I think this is part of the work that Elaine and others have been involved in around those things. I think that's a very good initiative. Also associated with that, I think has been a range of wider union strategies and climate justice strategies dealing with work issues. Some of these have been an attempt to develop strategies of specific sectors, how to kind of speak and address workers working in dirty jobs, how to speak to workers that are affected by greenwashing. There's been a range of things that have been emerging out of the union movement in Canada and also in Europe about how to deal with those kinds of organizing issues. Secondly, another area has been developing a range of local green jobs coalitions, which have attempted to unite different elements of the environmental movement and the union movement in around green jobs to kind of develop an action strategy towards, say, local governments or reinforce some of the bargaining that specific unions are involved in. And I think it's been also important just for generalizing the notion that climate justice is not something that should be separate from union issues and integrating the two together. I think this has been a very, very important initiative, and the local labor movement in Toronto has actually been very good on this. I think another aspect has been some of the things that the international union networks internationally have been doing around global international framework agreements in and around climate change issues. A lot of the international union federations have been negotiating a range of things in and around that. The third area I think I'll just quickly mention has been the itemizing of a range of areas where you can deal with a just transition and energy shifts and a whole range of ideas related to climate change and climate justice where it would be employment expansionary. I won't go into that because Bob just spoke about it, but there's a whole range of kind of positive initiative been occurring there. I want to finish by, I think, just raising some of the limitations of this approach and some of the issues that I think can't be put to the side and we have to kind of pick up as well. This partly comes out of the work that we have been engaged in Toronto, and some of us have been working on green job stuff going back to the Green Jobs Coalition that we formed in the late 80s, early 90s that dealt with kind of a range of these issues that we have been debating for a long time. One of them, I think, and it's been particularly striking during the response to the financial crisis, is how isolated much of the discussion of the Green New Deal has been from the traditional demands of the left. I think it's just been striking how they haven't been there. What I think is important about that is that, in fact, many of those traditional demands from the left around these issues are, in fact, climate justice demands. And they can be posed that way. The core one clearly is, right, work time reduction, a radical reduction in work time. This is a core demand of the labor movement historically. We're now in, what is it, the 40th year almost without any kind of systematic movement in reduction of work time. Again, Canada is the worst sinner in this, in that we've moved our standard work hours from 40 to 48 hours, moved in the opposite direction. Yeah. in the key provinces that count, British Columbia and Ontario, which are also the key provinces which have strong labor movements. I think that's a systematic area. I think the demand that has particularly come from the women's movement, that has been an important demand from the left about the expansion of the caring sector, has to be posed as a greenhouse gas reduction strategy as well, linked to the decommodification question. This is a fundamental demand of not only gender justice but environmental justice. The expansion of education, the expansion of public transit, environmental cleanup, and something that was teased at from the old studies from the 1930s that Jeremy was speaking about is, of course, that the redistribution of income is a climate justice demand and has to be posed that way. I think those things are all demands that have to be integrated in the demands for a Green New Deal on this point, and we haven't done a very good job of that. That speaks to the weakness of the wider left. Secondly, the limit, I would say, is the question of endless accumulation and capitalism. And capitalism is a system of endless accumulation and commodification. I think a core Marxist theorem has been around that. Its corollary theorems have related to that this is then a process of the continual metabolism of nature, the production of space, the utilization of energy. And a conclusion that follows from this has typically been the conclusion that it has been impossible to expect a dematerialization related to capitalist production. Therefore, even if we support, and I would, the kind of strategy that Bob just put forward, its linkage in this core historical and analytical problem of assessing capitalism can't be left to the side. And I think that, for me, this is why the question of needs is integral to the climate justice strategy that we want to put forward in terms of a Green New Deal. The final thing I'll just raise quickly is, yeah, I'm done. Is the organizational foundation for an alternative strategy. And I think here it's the general and wider problem of the left. Social democracy is not offering an alternative ecology strategy. And as you know, as we've seen during the crisis, has reinforced its linkages to neoliberalism and has even and adopted the austerity general. There is a corollary to that in that the big Engos have largely also moved in a direction of market ecology and accepted a range of parameters around neoliberal bargaining. Therefore, I think what we're beginning with in dealing with an alternative is where we are in specific good campaigns. There's good campaigns in Canada around the fracking question, around tar sands, etc. Some of the things I just spoke about in terms of the union movement. But this is still begging the question of whether this can occur without an adequate anti-capitalist movement in Canada or anywhere else. Thank you.